Good afternoon. Welcome to another edition of Talk of the Towns here at NYAOT. We have a great guest with us here today, but before we get to David, I just want to remind you, if you like what you're seeing, please make sure that you hit like, share, and subscribe. Like, share, and subscribe. Critically important to build the audience. And as always, if you have any ideas or have any comments about the podcast, please make sure you email us at nytowns.org. If you'd like to see something, we like to help bring that to you, nytowns.org. We're coming to you here today just before Memorial Day. It feels more like Veterans Day out there, but hopefully you all will have a great Memorial Day. By the time you see this, it would have been Memorial Day, so I hope you had a great Memorial Day. So with us today, we have a great guest. This is a very interesting, I think, very timely topic here at Memorial Day. We have David Fleming with us. David, you are an attorney over at, I want to make sure I get this right, Featherstonhaugh?
Well, so it's a terrifying thing to say that I was an attorney. I'm not, actually. I'm a lobbyist, but I'm one of the few non-attorneys that are running a law firm in Albany. So I run the Featherstonhaugh firm in Albany and have been with them for about 32 years.
So who has the higher approval rating, the attorneys or the lobbyists?
Depends on who you talk to. It's different levels of hell, I guess, depending on who you speak to.
Those are just approval ratings, that's all. But more importantly, the work you do in your community, you've been the supervisor for 18 years in the town of Nassau.
That's correct.
5 terms, and you're still in your office.
Yes, still there.
How do you like it?
Working away, loving it. It's it's one of those few roles in government where you can actually see real impact on what you're doing, and so that's why I've been hanging around, and I'm thankful that the voters have kept me around for that long. It's really enjoyable to see positive change on a local level.
Yeah. Well, you're doing good work, obviously, if you've been around almost 19 years and still going, and unopposed this year.
We hope, yes.
Yeah, so you're gonna keep going. It's such an important job, and I know it, but it takes a lot of time. People can say, "Oh, a town of 5,000 or whatever," but it takes a lot of time, doesn't it? I mean,
it really does. And one of our senators said to me one time, he referred to me as a small town mayor with big city problems, and I think that the complexities of local government are really significant. And in some ways more challenging than you would have in an urban area because we don't have the resources and we don't have the leverage that a lot of folks would have on the state level and the federal level. So we make do with what we can and have robust results for our residents.
Yes, absolutely. Well, you're right over there in Rensselaer County across the river, so whatever we can do, let us know. We love to be here to help, obviously, our member towns. Another great member town, by the way. So it's an appropriate time to maybe talk about this, but we're talking about cemeteries today and the role that a town plays in particularly abandoned cemeteries, but maybe get a better understanding of how cemeteries and towns interact. As you know, I always say this, I guess, at some point I'll stop saying it, but I was the supervisor of the town of Glenville for a while, and we had a few cemeteries that we kind of took on. One of them was the Yates family cemetery, which was fairly significant sized cemetery, believe it or not. They had some connection to Governor Yates, but it wasn't Governor Yates. And I think he was interned there, however, very early, and then he was brought down to Brooklyn, if I have this correctly, afterwards. But anyway, with Memorial Day approaching, as I mentioned, how do you feel the place of cemeteries, what role do cemeteries play in a town? It seems passive, right? Everyone's driving and you go by a cemetery and you don't even think about it. But what role does a cemetery play for a town?
Well, it's really going forward, particularly today when we face so many challenges with outmigration in the state and lack of connection. We have a lot of communities across, particularly upstate, where we have a lot of significant influx of residents who have no connection to that cemetery. They are really touchstones of history, so it's an opportunity for a community to highlight its history. I always encourage communities to engage with their historians. There's plenty of programs that you can copy around the state where other towns are doing really good jobs in connecting local history to create a sense of place for the community. And I think they really provide us that story that a lot of people are looking for. And it's a great way to engage even new residents who want to learn about local history.
That's great. I mean, I love the fact that we talk about how important local history is, particularly town history to the state, and then how that plays into the federal, the nation's history, which we're celebrating the sesquicentennial next year. And so I think there's a great opportunity for towns to celebrate their history more and maybe find some of the clues of the past in those cemeteries. One of the challenges we always had was the vital record situation, right? So somebody will see a headstone and they'll want to learn more about that person, but they can't get that information, right? Because it's all vital records and it's governed under that law, correct?
Correct. So, I mean, there are ways to address that. We've certainly taken some historical records that were given to us where the public has gone about and, created a public profile of the cemeteries in our community. We've posted it on the town website, made those accessible. There are other historical groups that are interested in creating, even now, QR code tours for cemeteries that municipalities can engage with.
So, what are some of the challenges that you see cemeteries facing today?
Well, there is a stress on cemeteries today that we've never seen before, and that has a direct impact on local municipalities. I mentioned out-migration, so we certainly have, folks who are moving away and not having that connection to the local cemetery. There's the increase in the cremation rate. It's almost 70% upstate, and as you would guess,
70%.
Yes, so as cremation rates increase, the final disposition of those remains doesn't necessarily occur, or someone's taking those remains to another state with them or something. So those burial fees that would be paid to the nonprofit cemetery aren't there. So you got a drop in revenue. And obviously the volatility of the markets and cemeteries, for investments and, bank accounts for cemeteries, which is pretty much what a lot of them upstate are relying on. They don't have those resources and robust returns. So you've got a decrease in the amount of revenue, and you have a significant increase that we're all facing in towns, of expenditures. So it's significantly challenging for those local cemeteries, and that has an impact and potential impact for our municipalities.
Right. It's funny. My wife and I have been to Italy a couple times, and we've talked to people how they have run out of space. And I often think about land. And I often think about that as I'm driving around and I go past a cemetery. And at some point, there's not going to be enough land there anymore. What happens then, right? So is that something that you're thinking about 10 years, 20 years down the road? Where are we going to find places to have cemeteries?
That is a challenge for local zoning, and certainly we see a lot of cemeteries. The bigger problem is going to be that long-term maintenance piece, even after their doors are closed. So the town law 291 is really the stopgap for cemeteries to prevent their abandonment. So technically, under state statute, cemeteries are not ultimately abandoned. They become the responsibility of the municipality in which they're located, more specifically the towns in which they're located. So the trust funds and the operational funds of those cemeteries have to be enough to continue their operation. Otherwise, the municipality is required to step in and take over the cemetery, which could be a huge fiscal impact depending on the size of the cemetery. So we're all facing the tax cap and expenditures associated with it. And just thinking about caring for another 100 acres, which of essentially parkland, can be tremendously impactful for a town.
Do you see cemeteries being something of going away at some point just because there's not enough space anymore? Like, go 50 years ahead or 75 years ahead. Is there ever going to be a time where it's like we just don't have any space for cemeteries? What I'm understanding in Europe is they're essentially almost renting the space where they start burying loved ones with others who are in the ground already, or maybe even taking them out. And do you see anything like that happening here?
Well, in the urban areas of New York, certainly there are places where the cemeteries are filling up and they're running out of space. There are some cemeteries in the city who have less than 20 years left. With the increase in cremation rate, you're going to see less people being interred, but you'll also require less space. So folks are going to be doing that. But doing that kind of final disposition, I think people should be engaged with cemeteries, and we can continue to do that. Upstate, the bigger problem is it's not that there's not enough land, it's just that there's not enough people to continue the operation. So I think for many municipalities across upstate New York, there's plenty of room available for decades to come. And in fact, the statutes have been amended recently to allow for mergers. So it'll be easier for nonprofits to merge together. If you have a cemetery that's running out of space, that's really fiscally sound, they might be able to take over a cemetery that's not running as well, but has plenty of land, and be able to continue that operation, which is certainly a relief for the local town that wouldn't have to take over a cemetery.
I know you and our staff work very hard on legislation over the years. Have been working hard. But what do you view is the status now of cemetery abandonment across New York? Like, is it happening at a greater rate? Is it 5% of the cemeteries? Kind of, what's the status for the abandonment?
Sure. So when I started doing this a number of years ago, and this being helping local nonprofit cemeteries, there were 1,800 regulated cemeteries in New York. So those are cemeteries regulated by the state of New York. Should they become abandoned, they become the responsibility of the local town. We're down to 1,600. We've lost 5% in the last couple of years. That number I expect to be escalating within the next 10 years. There is I think to back up, cemeteries really didn't have trust funds generally and operational funds that were trusts until like 1940. There are plenty of cemeteries who have special trusts where someone was particularly wealthy in the community in the 1800s and left a large chunk of money in their estate to the cemetery, and that's great. But that's not most cemeteries in New York. So of what essentially is now 1,600 cemeteries in New York, a significant percentage of them will face significant fiscal crisis in the years to come. And that is a real concern for local towns. I think that's, we've taken over 4 cemeteries in my community and during my tenure. And, it's a big hit it's the mowing, it's the operation. We did a burial this morning. I have a small team, so I'm coordinating this morning with my local funeral director to make sure that the burial was going to go off okay. And it was in a cemetery that was very old and not easy to access. And so it had all those challenges. So, you face highway departments or parks that are not necessarily that excited about operating a cemetery. So, the position I've always taken, and certainly working with folks in the cemetery world, is that cemeteries are best run by cemeteries. So anything we can do to prevent their abandonment, that's great. And NYAOT has been great over the years working with cemeteries to try to promote anti-abandonment legislation so that the towns don't have to take over these cemeteries.
Thank you. I know that's been something that Lori in particular, and you've been very much active on, and it's important. There are different classes of towns, and there's different classes of cemeteries. Are all classes of town required to take cemeteries? And can you talk about the different classes of cemetery?
Sure. So every town has to take over the cemeteries that are abandoned in their community. It's not the counties can, they don't. The villages can, they will not. So everyone can read the law and see it says towns, and so they're more than happy to let the towns take over those cemeteries. And there is hope. I mean, there is the Abandoned Cemetery Fund in the state budget. It used to be, like many things in New York, used to be a separate trust fund, which then became swept every year in the general fund. And hasn't existed as a standalone trust fund for a really long time. That's only $2 million to take care of all the abandonment costs in a particular year. We always spend it for localities as well as dangerous monument applications or vandalism. Actually, the New York State Association of Cemeteries is advocating for a next budget cycle to increase that to $2.5 million to kind of right size it. And to give your watchers a understanding, we had one abandonment in the North Country that cost $2.5 million for 2 very small communities and 2 small towns and active members in NYAOT to deal with. And that required a completely separate budget allocation because $2.5 million was more than was even in the fund for just one.
And that's taxpayer funded fund?
It is. It's paid through a surcharge of $5 per burial. But that was, as I said, that's been long swept away. So there are a couple of classes of cemeteries, 3 classes of cemeteries. The primary class is the one that everyone would understand, the first class of cemeteries, which is just a public regulated cemetery that's regulated by the state of New York. Easy to find. You can go on the Department of State website, list them all by municipality and county. And you can find those. Those are the ones that the cemetery or the municipalities really need to worry about and be concerned about and have an active dialogue with to understand that those are the challenges facing them. But there are also, I like to refer to them as the ticking time bombs, and that is there's a case that from many decades ago, Convy Boylan in New York, that said if a private family cemetery or a private cemetery is selling graves to the general public, they're inherently the responsibility of the municipality because they're a public cemetery. So those are also cemeteries we have to be concerned about. But generally, it's the regulated cemeteries that folks run into every day and are facing, abandonment that would be clearly communicated to the municipality that they need to be active and be prepared.
So you talked a little bit about this fund. Are there any other funds that are available for towns, or any other funding sources, grants, anything like that that would help for towns to either take on or operate, maintain a cemetery?
So I'd like the answer to be yes, and I get calls from supervisors and town board members across the state all the time, and my answer always has to be no. But the Abandoned Cemetery Fund is helpful in that it is a one-time opportunity to secure funds to get the place ready, the cemetery ready that's abandoned, for easier maintenance. So that can be all sorts of things. And I'm doing one right now in my own community. We just received an abandonment a few months ago. So we're doing a survey. So we're getting a survey to make sure we know that when we replace the fence, which is also covered, that it's within the bounds of the cemetery, uprighting the monuments, taking down some trees, purchasing equipment for only dedicated use. The state won't let you purchase equipment for your highway department, which you could also use for the cemetery. But they'll even allow for a small building to be erected to maintain that equipment and to house that equipment. So there are a lot of things that go into that one-time funding stream. The thing that I always caution towns, which they frequently forget, and I know firsthand how slowly things can work on the local level as you're trying to get bids and everything, post-pandemic in particular, where you're trying to get contractors to respond to you. You only have 5 years to submit an application from the date of abandonment. And I can tell you the first year goes pretty quick. And then, so, you could have changes in administration on the local level. So you really need to get working. 5 years can go very fast, and you have a 5-year time limit to get an application into the state to get that one set of funds to help alleviate some of the pain from taking over an abandoned cemetery.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think a lot of communities, a lot of towns don't know that.
That's true. I hear from a lot of folks that had no idea, and then they'll contact me 8 years out. There has been some statutory changes in the last couple of years where individual municipalities have requested that the not-for-profit corporation law be amended so that they can put in an application. But as you know, those are very difficult to get through the legislature, particularly in this economic situation.
One of the things that in my town we were successful with on our cemeteries that we were taking care of seems to be the Eagle Scout candidates seem to like to come in and do some work. And I know that's not like weekly maintenance or whatever, but they would clean the gravestones, do research on the folks, whatever, fix gravestones. Do you see a lot of volunteerism to help maintain these cemeteries happening, or is that just anecdotally? Do you see any?
No, I have seen a lot of it in maybe the last 5 years. There's been an increase in folks that want to do that. There are certainly organizations that can help you properly clean and maintain those gravestones. They have to be done in a particular way. I see plenty of people who use chemicals and things that can be really bad for those stones. Important to note, the towns, even if they take over a cemetery or a cemetery that's just operating, they do not own the gravestones. So those are private property purchased by the families. So you need to seek out a posting of a notice or something if you're going to do these programs so that people are aware that you're going to be doing these programs. I have a lot of towns that say they can't do it. I think that's really because they don't want to do it. But again, getting back to what I had said earlier about being an ability to mesh those stories with the people that you have now and get engagement in those cemeteries, it's a great way to do that. Most town insurance policies cover volunteer activities. I would never have someone getting on a ladder or climbing up a big gravestone, but if you have a small gravestone, they can be taught how to clean it properly. There are plenty of folks out there who do that, and it's a great way to have your historian engage with residents and Boy Scouts and other groups. And we have an almost annual program in my community where we have our historian, who's great at cleaning gravestones and is trained, and she teaches a class, and people come in and clean the gravestones and have done tremendous work in one of our particular cemeteries.
What you just said is so interesting to me because it's like when you think that you take over this property, you think you take over everything on the property, but in reality, you're not. And although some of these gravestones would be considered probably abandoned property because these families from 100 years ago may not be coming back, and it's just fascinating to me. So I kind of viewed it in my mind as like a condo situation, right? The town owns all the common area, and those folks own their own tombstones.
Yes. So there's a lot to it, and more than you think. In an abandonment process, the town really has to decide whether or not they want to take title of the property itself in total. Otherwise, they have a maintenance requirement under the statute. But that limits you on what you can do on the grounds later on. And I always try as a town supervisor to look at something and say, how am I going to make money on that to help offset the cost of operating it? So I always look for ways that I can operate the cemetery and bring in some revenue to offset the tremendous cost associated with mowing and maintenance. And we've done that through taking title. And so in the abandonment process, we've had met with the Division of Cemeteries, who supervises the cemeteries, and met with them on an abandonment meeting. And we asked the board that's leaving, that's no longer able to maintain the cemetery, the remaining board members, to pass a resolution passing title along and authorizing a quitclaim deed to the town so that we can assume title of the property and be able to operate and maintain the grounds.
So you touched on this a little bit, I think, but regardless of if the town takes title or does not, or just has the maintenance agreement, is whatever happens on that property at that point the town liable for?
Yes.
So if someone goes and parties at night and someone gets hurt, that's going to be on the town.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there are obviously a lot of factors associated with that, but that has been my argument from the beginning when I've been doing it. As long as I've been town supervisor, it's just like, if we're going to be responsible, ultimately, I want to be in control of the grounds. I want to be able to do what we need to do on the property. And that just clears it up. And so that makes it much easier.
So it sounds as though from this conversation, and no surprise here, but cemeteries are very highly regulated. Are there anything that towns who are listening should know about, maybe new laws or anything in specific they should know about regulation if they were going to take or have to take on this responsibility?
Sure. So recently we touched on the large abandonment, actually the largest abandonment in state history in the North Country, $2.5 million impact, immediate fiscal impact to those towns. We were able to mitigate that. But out of that abandonment became a change in state law, and which NYAOT actually worked with the New York State Association of Cemeteries on, was to prevent that kind of scheme, essentially, which was the cemetery operation that became run by funeral directors who, there were a whole host of things that are, allegedly to have gone wrong. But they were standalone columbariums and mausoleums. So columbarium is the place where you put they have the niches that you put the cremated remains in. And mausoleum, obviously the above ground community mausoleum that you would put the bodies in. These were standalone entities that had no actually in-ground cemetery space as people would consider a cemetery. But technically under the statute, they were cemeteries. And were abandoned and were in tremendous disrepair, as you can imagine. One of them had a 8-foot poplar tree growing out of the roof when I pulled into the parking lot with one of our state senators. And so the statute was changed to say you can no longer have standalone columbariums or mausoleums. They have to be part of a cemetery, a regulated cemetery. That change even passed through to the religious corporations law. So municipalities need to understand, if they get a zoning or planning application where a firehouse or some fraternal group wants to put one of these columbariums, which are these, maybe 24 to 48 niche cremation products on their property, and that's a new thing that people like to do. They, if they have a building, they want to include that in their building or in a parkland. They have to have a contract under state law with a regulated nonprofit cemetery for the final disposition of those remains if that fraternal order or the church ever goes out of business. And that's really to protect the local municipality to keep from having to to deal with these remains after this organization has gone out of business. So that's a really big one. One of the recent changes just in the last couple of years is the ability of cemeteries to lease their property. This is good news for localities because now you have a situation where land that's not taxable because it's taken up by cemetery purposes. If a cemetery has excess land, say I have 100 acres, only 20 is developed, they're not going to use the rest of it for 100 years, they could lease it for under certain restrictions for for-profit operations. And so it can be developed as long as there's a bond in place to return it back to cemetery purposes. And there's a whole host of statutory changes that were done to allow that. And that's a real opportunity, really two ways. One, to increase the revenue resources of a cemetery to keep them from being abandoned, and also to help get some money back into the locality. So really, really good opportunity. The one thing I didn't touch on, which I think is important, is not new, but it is a local cemetery and municipality issue, is that many towns do not have any requirements associated with backyard burials. And people are like, well, what does that mean? Well, that means you have no rule restricting human remains from being put in a cemetery. So people can bury someone or their cremated remains in your backyard. That's great if it was, 150 years ago and someone thought the family was going to be there forever. But the reality of this, mobile society, that does not happen. And I get town supervisors call me all the time, ready to pull their hair out that, there's some huge conflict between families who have sold property and families who want to visit graves. If municipalities do not have a law on the books, they really should consider one of the model laws that's out there to restrict backyard burials.
So I don't think about that as I drive around and you see old cemeteries in yards that, obviously new folks are living in. If there wasn't an agreement in place, an easement agreement or anything like that, does an ancestor have the right to go visit that spot on private property?
No, if there's no easement and no access. And so frequently what we see is the transfer of cemeteries inclusive within a deed. So, when someone sells the property, it's sold. And, that gets to a cemetery maintenance issue for towns too. There are a whole host of issues that you have to look at if someone's coming to you saying they have an abandoned cemetery. And if it's a family cemetery, there's no specific requirement immediately that you would take it over. And I don't know any town supervisor or town board member who wants to send their highway crew across private property to get to a cemetery. So,
right, especially if they don't have
a lot
to.
of challenges, especially if you don't have to. Absolutely.
So, what are the members, or what are the steps that our members should be taking to manage these takeovers? If they're in a situation where they have to take it over, what advice would you give them on how that process would unfold?
Well, I would always encourage towns to get in front of the situation. So if you have, an expectation that there's going to be abandonment, try to engage as quickly as possible. NYAOT worked with the New York State Association of Cemeteries to require a process where the state works with the towns to try to manage the slow unraveling of these abandonments. Either to prevent them or to make it so that it's orderly. So the town should be involved in the final meeting of the cemetery board to, as I said, to communicate how you'd like to either receive or not receive the deed to the property. And then I always encourage towns to do, when they accept the property, to do a formal resolution accepting it. It creates a start date for your application to the state cemetery board, and then no one can come back to you and say, oh, you missed the deadline. You actually have a date certain. So I'd encourage them to do that. But then you have to deal with a whole host of issues that never makes your town clerk happy, and that's the records management associated with these cemeteries. Many times you'll get, here's the banker's box or here's the shoe box, and they're going to have to be responsible for that. There are plenty of online tools, and certainly, there are organizations that provide form rules and regulations for the new municipal cemetery. You're going to need to have those. You're going to need to have deeds. You're going to need to have a monument form, which most municipalities don't have. And I have an opportunity occasionally. I was just speaking at the conference in New York City, and we talked about that. That was a hot topic. You should have a monument installation form. And why that's important is it's the ability of the town to track who's in the cemetery. So you're going to get proof of insurance from whoever the monument dealer is who's going to be working on it. On a particular gravestone for the family member, you're going to be able to see the gravestone before it's installed to make sure that it's compliant with what your rules and regulations are. So it's a way to track, but it's also another revenue stream. For instance, in my town, it's not a big deal, but it's $25. It covers the time of the code enforcement officer to take a look at the form, but it gives you a real understanding of what's going on in your cemetery. So there are a whole host of documents that really need to be executed. Most of them are form documents and easy for towns to be able to access.
These one of the things I got when I was supervisor a couple times actually, and I don't know if you call them maybe green burials now or whatever, but these folks that want to take the cremated remains of their loved ones and buy a tree in a park and bury under the tree, or this thing that biodegrades and feeds the tree or the roots or something like this. What are the complications involved in that? Is that I believe it's allowed.
Yes. Well, that's a really good point. So this is a practical thing. Never encourage anyone to be mixing remains with some living organism. So what happens when the tree dies?
Yeah.
And then what's the municipality doing? We cut down the tree who happened to be, associated with whoever your living relative was. That's a problem. Municipalities should stick with natural burial. And that is usually setting aside areas. A lot of towns in New York are really on the forefront of this, particularly upstate. I've been working with a few towns recently who have had tremendous success with natural burial. So they're taking the existing cemeteries, setting aside a section, either a wooded section or a meadow section. And those are burials that are in, plain pine boxes or wicker caskets. The remains are not embalmed. Very simple burials and done quite simply. They're lower maintenance. So if they're meadow, they're only maybe mowed once or twice a year for wildflowers and habitat. Or they're in the woods and they create paths and they allow cremated remains to be put, in specific locations. I really like, as a town supervisor, the low maintenance piece, and again, it's a revenue form for the town, but it creates that engagement in the cemetery as well. People are still going to a cemetery, but maybe for a different reason.
When we got the request for this to be a living tree with the remains in the park and all that, I had a hard time getting my head around it. And I said, what's going to happen the first time that someone lets their dog relieve themselves on the tree and some family member sees that, it's like, it just doesn't mesh.
There are a whole host of issues associated with it. So I try to avoid them as much as possible, and let's just stick with the natural burial. And it is really taken off across, particularly upstate, well, even in urban areas of the state.
I think we highlighted here today all the different issues towns face. So many different challenges, and this is certainly yet another one. Anything that we didn't touch on that you wanted to make sure we added, or anything else to add?
Well, I always encourage, particularly the NYAOT meetings, I try to encourage town boards to do outreach. And as I said earlier, it's pretty easy to find out who the regulated cemeteries are in your community. Go on the Department of State website under cemeteries. It'll list all the cemeteries. Do some outreach. Break up between the board members, those contacts, and reach out to those cemeteries and just try to understand where they are, how they're doing. Make sure that they're operating okay. Towns do have the ability under the general municipal law to provide in-kind services. So if you have a cemetery that is on the border, not doing great, and all it means is to help them out is we're doing a road project and you do the apron on the entrance, pave the apron on the entrance to their cemetery. It makes a huge difference for people to be able to access the cemetery. To do that, but really engage with the cemeteries ahead of time to see if there's something that you can do to help them out that's not necessarily a financial impact on the municipality. And if there's nothing you can do, at least prepare that there's going to be a problem where these cemeteries might eventually be abandoned. There are a lot of cemeteries in New York that are very well run, that are doing great and operating very well. But as I said, in pockets of the state where out-migration has occurred, there are financial challenges and expenses, those are the cemeteries that are in trouble. And we need to be proactive as local officials, because we have nothing else to do, to reach out and try to understand better what's going on in their community. I've been doing these meetings locally in my town the last couple of months up for annual meetings. I show up at annual meetings. And it's pretty eye-opening. You get an understanding of where the needs are.
Well, I think this has been great, very timely, as I mentioned, with Memorial Day right upon us, and I appreciate all your time, David, all your work you do on behalf of, ensuring that our history is preserved through our cemeteries, and I know you and our staff work very well together, and we appreciate that very much. Appreciate your membership, first and foremost. So thank you very much for being here today. As I had mentioned, one way to help us is if you like what you see, please make sure you hit like, subscribe, and share on either, we're on YouTube. You can watch on YouTube. You can listen on Spotify or the Apple platform. And so as we continue to grow, we're looking for you to be part of our podcast. Make sure you drop us a note in nytowns.org, anything you want to see here or any comments you have. But we hope that you have had, by the time you watch this, a very wonderful Memorial Day and a great summer ahead.